Welcome to this second message in the series, Messy Spirituality. As I said last week, there's a little book that you can pick up in the office if you're interested in exploring these themes a little more deeply. Last week at the end of that message, I asked you to acknowledge the truth. I asked you to turn to someone near you and say to that person, "I'm a mess." And you did it with a lot of laughter. And we did that because we are trying to overcome this habit that we have of hiding ourselves in the church, of whitewashing our lives in the church. And then I had you turn to Jesus in your inmost heart and say to him, "Jesus, I'm a mess, and I need you," because that's also the truth. And then I had you turn towards yourself and say, I am a mess, and Jesus loves me anyway. That's the fundamental premise of this whole series. And today we're going to look at it from a little different perspective. We're going to look at how the mess that we are can sometimes get in the way of people who God is drawing to the doors of our churches, how the ways we act in the church sometimes can be off-putting to people who are new to all of that. I want to start with a little story about a group called the Missionaries of Charity, which is a group of nuns who were headed by Mother Teresa. And back in 1988, Mother Teresa worked with the mayor of New York for some time, and after that work, the city of New York agreed to sell two old, dilapidated buildings that were really in danger of falling down to the sisters, the Missionaries of Charity, for $1 each. And the deal was that the sisters, the Missionaries of Charity, would renovate the buildings and they would turn them into a shelter and temporary housing for homeless men. Up to 64 men would be able to be housed in these buildings. The plans were elaborate. There was going to be a dining room and kitchen down on the first floor. The second floor was going to be a lounge. The third and fourth floors were going to be places for men to live, dormitory rooms. The thing about the Missionaries of Charity is that they have a vow of poverty and they live very simply. And they don't believe in using things like dishwashers or clothes washers or clothes dryers, or that they do things by hand. And the people who lived in these buildings were going to do the same thing. That was going to be part of their work to move out of homelessness and into the world. So there would be no modern conveniences in these two buildings. And they had $500,000 set aside for these renovations, and they began the process of drawing up plans and going before the city to figure out how to get the permits and all of those kinds of things. And it was arduous that Mother Teresa and some of her other sisters would go to these meetings. It took them about a year and a half to get the first round of approvals, and then they began the work on the buildings. And they started and everything was going along fine, and then the city came back and said, by the way, for any new or renovated building in the city of New York, you must install elevators. Well, the elevators would cost $100,000 each, adding them to those old buildings. And so the sisters thought, well, that's no problem. We'll just go explain who we are. We would never use an elevator. That's a modern convenience. So they went back to the city and they had that conversation and they said, we wouldn't use elevators, and so we don't think we should have to put them in. And they went round and round, and ultimately the city said, if you don't put in elevators, you can't do the project. And so Mother Teresa met with some of her sisters, and they talked through that, and they decided that those several $100,000 that they would have to use to put in elevators, that was a foolish expenditure. They could use that money for other purposes, to feed the poor, for instance. And Mother Teresa walked away from that project, and it was never done. And when you first hear that story, when I first read this story, I thought, how dumb is that? All of those people who could have been helped. The city of New York could have been deeply touched by taking that many homeless men off the streets and training them up and getting them functional and back into housing and back into life. And they bypassed it because they couldn't make an exception to the rules. That's just dumb. We would have done better, wouldn't we? Wouldn't we have used our merciful hearts to decide in a different way? And as I think about that, I say, well, maybe we would have. But I'm not real sure. Because when I examine my own heart, what I realize is that at my most basic innermost, I am a rule follower to a fault. I just am. I want to do things the way that they are supposed to be done. Maybe it's my age and my generation. I suspect that the generations that are older than me are even more so. That's one of the reasons that for me this conflict in the United Methodist Church is so difficult. I believe we've come to a set of rules, and it's very hard for me to conceive of throwing them away and acting in another way. I want to please people. I want my I's dotted. I want my T's crossed. I want everything in its place. I don't like getting into trouble. I don't like getting other people into trouble. And when I think of that in the light of the story that you just heard, and when I think of it in the light of the Old Testament and the New Testament, I think maybe at heart I'm really a good Pharisee. You know? Do you ever think about that about yourself? I'm a good Pharisee. The Pharisees were not bad people. They were people trying to be good. They believed the law had been given to them by God, and therefore they took it very seriously. And they tried to do everything it asked them to do. And one of the things it asked them to do was to have rest on the Sabbath, complete rest. And in modern day Judaism, in the more conservative traditions, or Orthodox traditions, they're very careful to define what work is. You can walk this far, but you can't walk that far, because that would turn into work. So you can hold the Sabbath, you can walk to the synagogue, but you have to live within a certain distance of the synagogue. You can't turn a light switch on the Sabbath, because that's work. So you turn the light switches on before the Sabbath. You cook before the Sabbath. You put the stuff in a crock pot so that it's waiting there for you on Saturday night. Now, that's what was going on in this community. That's, to them, faithful. It sounds kind of silly to us, but if you really believe in following the rules, then you're careful about what they say and what they mean. And that's how it works out. So when this miracle happened, and this man had an encounter with Jesus that was absolutely life-changing. You know, he was blind, and all of a sudden he could see. He had been a beggar his whole life because he couldn't do anything else. And all of a sudden he could see, and his whole life was changed. And his friends and neighbors were like, well, this can't even be him. They couldn't recognize him because he was so functional. And then they took him to the Pharisees, and this was so outside their comfort zone, the possibility that a person born blind could now see, that they struggled to understand what was happening. Now, the first thing that occurred to them was it's the Sabbath. The healer couldn't be from God, because healers from God would not heal on the Sabbath. It violated the Sabbath laws. And so when the man talked to them about what happened, they thought, well, this bumpkin, he's an uneducated man. He could never have learned to read because he couldn't see. So they couldn't believe him. So they call in the parents, this grown man. They call in his parents, and they ask the parents and ask, how could this man who was born blind now see? And they were a little afraid to answer, because the Pharisees were known to be very strict. And so they just said, ask him. We don't know. We do know that he was born blind, and we do know that now he can see, but you have to ask him. And so they did. They brought him back in. This story is so long, and it goes, I mean, you didn't hear half of it. There's more after this stopping place that I chose. You know, they brought him in, and they said to him, well, if this guy did this healing on the Sabbath, he must be a sinner. He was automatically a sinner. And he says, I don't know. I don't know if he's a sinner. I just know that once I was blind, and now I can see. Do you see how they're dancing around this miracle? It's so crazy. And it gets hot after this, and they start kind of going back and forth, the man and the Pharisees. He got impatient, and he said, why do you need to hear this again? Do you want to be his disciple? And that made him mad. Things were escalating a little bit, and they reviled him. I mean, he has nobody, he's no credentials, but he has said these amazing words a little further down in the story. This is the blind man speaking. Here is the astonishing thing. You do not know where he comes from, and yet he opened my eyes. We know that God does not listen to sinners, but he does listen to one who worships him and obeys his will. Never since the world began has it been heard that anyone opened the eyes of a person born blind. If this man were not from God, he could do nothing. And they answered, you were born entirely in sin. And that reflected the belief that was expressed at the beginning of the story, that the blindness must be the result of somebody's sin. You were born entirely in sin, and are you trying to teach us? And they drove him out. They threw him out of the synagogue. Isn't that amazing? They threw him out for the sin of telling the truth about this life-changing encounter that he had had with Jesus. It's a terrible indictment of the religious establishment of that day. There's a miraculous healing. A man who's never seen suddenly can see. And if that happened here, wouldn't we throw a party? I mean, wouldn't that be the thing to do? Shouldn't they have thrown a party? And that's not what they did. They excommunicated him instead. How does it happen that way? How does the work of Jesus get thrown out like that? Yaconelli writes in his book, religious people love the rules of religion more than they love Jesus. Rules become more important than the spiritual life. And that's a tough thing to hear. Because what he's saying there is it didn't just happen then, it happens now. That religious communities can, in and of themselves, be obstacles for persons who have been drawn to Jesus. And the people inside religious institutions can sometimes be obstacles for those that Jesus is doing miracles in their lives. Now sometimes those obstacles are us, is what that means. It's not that we mean any harm. We don't. The Pharisees didn't mean any harm. They were protecting their religious heritage. And we do the same. You know, we love the church. We do. We love the church. And we want everything in place the way we want it to be. We want our I's dotted. We want our T's crossed. We want everybody to dress nicely and behave. It was hard for people, I think, last week to dress down a little bit. Some people struggled with that. We have a certain way that we think things ought to be done. We want people to behave the way we want. We want them to like the hymns that we love. And when they come, we want them to want to do it the way we want to do it. We don't want coffee in our pews. We can't imagine anybody not loving things just the way we like them. You know? For many of us, that life-changing encounter with Jesus that we had is a long time ago. And since then, the edges have kind of been sanded off of that, and we may not remember it very well. And now we've settled in, and we have our pattern, and we want our pattern to stay the same so that we feel safe and we're not disturbed. It was disturbing to have that man come in who was healed. They'd never seen anything like that. It disturbed them. So I started thinking about what is the equivalent of that in this day? And I began to think about what happens here when someone walks in the doors who doesn't fit in the boxes that we have construed for our worship. And the first thing that came to mind was, let's say that the doors open and at the wrong time, because newcomers come at the wrong time. You do know that, right? They never know what time to come, and so that they always, they're a disruptive presence. Maybe the newcomer is someone who hasn't really been in the church since they were little bitty kids. And in fact, they've had a pretty hard life. They've been alcoholics or drug users, and sometime in the recent past, they started going to AA or NA, and they have been saved. And they're so grateful. And for the first time in a long time, they're not using, and they're sober and straight. And they're taking seriously that part of the 12 steps that says you have to rely on a higher power. And now they want to see what that looks like a little more deeply. And the doors open back here, and that person walks through. They don't know much about church, you know. They just know that once they were blind, and now they see. So what do we do with them? Are we going to have a party and say, you bet, so glad you're here. We'll do anything we can to support you. Because they'll be telling their story, because that's part of recovery, is telling your story. Or are we going to hear that story and say, well, hadn't been very long. I wonder if they're going to hang in here. And are we going to be afraid to invest in them because we're unsure whether they're going to make it? Do you hear the difference with that? We're going to celebrate and say, you bet, we're with you every step of the way. Or are we going to be going, I know a lot of people that didn't quite make it. And it makes such a difference, doesn't it? Or maybe the person that comes in now at 1040 is a teenager. Imagine that in Sun City West. Wouldn't that catch our attention? Maybe a teenager with a skateboard under his arm, and he's got tats and piercings, and if you knew his story, you would know that he's staying with his grandma for a few days while they figure out what to do because both his parents went to prison. And so it's a hard time for him. And the reason he walked in was that yesterday, one of his grandma's neighbors sat down and listened to his story and cared about him, and then said, I go to that church, that one down there on Meeker Boulevard. You want to go? I'll take you. And he didn't want to go. But then he was skateboarding out here, and he saw, and he said, that's that church. That guy must go there. And he just decided to walk in the front door. Now, he's got no reason to trust any of us. You know what I'm saying? In fact, he's got no reason to trust anybody, period. And he's got that skateboard under his arm, and he is not going to put it down. He needs to come in here and at the wrong time, and he needs to sit down with that skateboard next to him. And the question is, what are we going to do with that? Are we all going to be going, oh, gee, look at that? And what is that teenager doing in here? And why has he got that dirty skateboard on the pew? That's not okay. Are we going to be worrying about if we're nice to him, he may bring some friends back and grind on our benches? You know what that is, where they jump up and they take the edges off the benches? Ugh. Is that what's going to be in our mind? Or is what's going to be in our mind is, look at this, a miracle. God has brought this young man into a church, and it's our church. It's a miracle. Let's have a party. What do we need to do to help this kid? Makes such a difference. Maybe the visitor is a big burly guy with a Harley in the parking lot, and also he has tats and long hair. And the last time he was in church was at his mama's funeral, and they didn't treat him very nice, and he hasn't wanted to go back since then, and that was a long time ago. But he's getting older, And he's realizing that he's missed out on a lot of stuff, and he's trying to find a kernel of meaning for his life. And he's heard you can find that at a church. And so this is the church he happens to walk into. And he can see immediately that he does not fit with most of the people in this place. And he doesn't know a hymnal from a library book. And he doesn't know what a liturgist is. What do you do when you liturge, you know? And we hand him this piece of paper, and he looks at it, and he doesn't know what a hymn is. What's a hymn? H-Y-M-N, hymn. What is that? He doesn't know. Why did they give me this paper? What am I supposed to do with this paper? And what are we going to do with that guy? Are we going to have a party? Are we going to come around him in a way that makes him know that he's okay and that we're with him and that we're not going to make him do anything that he doesn't want to do and that we love him with the love of Christ? It's such a, we're such Pharisees. We don't realize it. We think that everybody who walks in already knows all this stuff. And we think that they should be able to act like us. But it's just like the Pharisees and the blind man. We who love our church can become obstacles to people like that. And one of the reasons they won't come back. It was very hard for them to come through the door. I think we lose track of that. For someone who's never walked into a church, it's kind of like me walking into a Mormon church. I did that once by accident. I was heading for something else, and I saw this. I thought it was the church I was supposed to go to. And I walked in, and it was so different. I don't know whether you've ever been there to a Mormon church. It was on the Sabbath, and they were all dressed up. Everybody was dressed up, and and I immediately knew that I was in the wrong place. Like that. Well, someone who's never been to a church, they have that feeling when they walk in here. We feel warm and welcome but it's scary to walk into a place that you've never been. And our rules can get in the way of that gracious work of Jesus that has brought them here. I want to say to you, if you are new to faith, I am always hopeful that there's at least one person in the room who's here for the very first time, that you are that person that I'm talking about. I just want to say to you, I'm so glad you're here. And we'll do what we can to help it work for you. Yeah, there's so much hope and love in the work of Jesus. If Jesus has brought you here and you're trying to see if there's room here, we're just so glad to have you in the room. And what I want to show you about this story is that the man born blind didn't know anything when Jesus came along. He didn't know anything about his love. And all he knew was that once he was blind and now he could see, and that's what he held on to while the Pharisees bullied him and ultimately threw him out. And the end of the story is this: Jesus came and found that man, and he revealed to that man who Jesus was and is. He told that man, I am the Son of Man. I am the light of the world. And that blind man who now can see said, Lord, I believe, and worshiped him. So that's the thing to do. Hold on to your story when people come along and bully you, not meaning to, but they do. Hold on to your story and count on Jesus, who will come and find you. And this story is a real cautionary note for those of us who are protecting our heritage. Pay attention. We don't want to be like these Pharisees. We want to have a party. We want to celebrate the work of Jesus in the lives of those he sends to us. I love what Yaconelli says at one point in his works. He says, Jesus meets us wherever